Hello and welcome back to the DnD note-taking application where we build or have built a full stack CRUD app from complete scratch. Again, I cannot help but impress myself that I managed to pull that off by basically winging it in those early videos. But here we are. We have built it. We completed the fundamental CRUD operations in the last video. Again, the application should be running. Doesn't look very pretty, but it got the job done, and we're looking at it right here. It had like the very simple nav bar, if that's what you want to call it. It could tell us if we're logged in or not. We used React Context API, so we made it and punched it up a little bit more advanced than normal to track our authentication status, whether we're logged in or not. The whole application will re-render if we happen to change that status via a state change, surprise, surprise. And unlike Redux, I actually had a student talk to me that's been following this video series and talk to me a little bit about this in Redux and whatnot. And I mentioned in particular, and I don't know if I was clear enough about this in the previous videos where I made some decisions. Redux in this kind of application would be complete overkill in my opinion, only because, well, each view is tied to an API endpoint, and any state changes for a note that happen to happen on the edit note screen eventually wind up as saved changes, and again, my users will eventually come back here and view their notes after making a fresh or new API request. So because each view we're looking at here in our React code on the client side is tied to an API endpoint, this page makes a request to get all the notes. This one requests to get a single node details. This one will delete the note. This one will edit the note. And whatever change we do, we come back here and it makes a request to get back in sync with the database. There's not a lot of dynamic or shared state changes happening. We could argue that we could have done Redux or Redux Toolkit preferably for the authentication, but again, having that one piece of state shared across my entire application and bringing in a tool like Redux for it is definitely what I would call overkill. Redux would at least allow us to not incur entire re-rendering changes, because with Redux, you can subscribe to small pieces of state with something called selectors. You can subscribe to a small piece of state, and only when that state changes would that component need to re-render. The opposite is true of the React Context API in our code that we've done here. So I want to point that out once again, because props.children of our context provider using the React Context API is the entire application, the navbar, and every single route we have. Just move some code around. And every single route we have, everything we see on the page or the view will re-render because it is a child of this state change, right? It is a child of the provider, and when its state changes, that's what's going to happen. A full-scale re-render, which could mean disastrous consequences in a large-scale application where everything should not be re-rendering. That's where, if that was an issue, I would then choose to bring in Redux Toolkit or something like that to avoid that problem, or there's some tricks you could do with some of the memoization and callbacks that you can, hooks that you can utilize to prevent those full-scale re-renders. But in our case, I think something as changing authentication state is a big enough thing to care about that I do want entire screens re-rendering, because if you're logged out, things should be happening. So, like I was kind of rambling about, I want to make sure that was clarified, not only for the student that asked me over the weekend in DMs, but for anyone else watching this YouTube video in the comments and stuff like that. And I talked about how we're finally going to punch it up and make it look a little bit nicer, and I don't know how long this is going to take, but I have come to my decisions on what I intend to use for styling. So, as a bit of background, before I was even a student at Covalence, I think when I was like in junior high, like 4th through 8th grade, I was on, my dad's work laptop goofing off on AOL 56K dial-up modem from way back in the day. If that tells you how old I am, 35 for reference. And I mess a lot with CSS1 by, copying and pasting people's AOL profiles to see how they made them look stylish, aka typically really edgy stuff like a black background and like blood red text and weird alignment and centering and whatnot. So I've never been great at styling, and that's like how I started my foray into like web development way back in the day when I was just a kiddo. Then, I did nothing with web development for pretty much all of high school, college, and a decade after college when I worked food service. But when I became a student at Covalence about 6-ish years ago, they taught me Bootstrap, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I used it on all of my labs where possible. When I first built out several of my own CRUD applications, again, what I learned here at this course and what I'm teaching y'all here in this YouTube series, I use Bootstrap because it's what I learned. It's what I became kind of dependent upon, especially for layout when it came to the column system and whatnot. And I loved its color system. I loved its utility class names of the few that it had. And I loved its simplified class names like button primary to quickly generate a good looking button without too much work, without having to write a ton of CSS, test it in multiple browsers, look at scaling issues and things like that. And then all of a sudden decide I need to learn to do CSS variables so I can change up its color based on pages and whatnot. So I built a ton of things in Bootstrap, right? A lot of my first portfolio projects, all Bootstrap, right? I learned how to change the themes to make it feel a bit more customized, but it was still very Bootstrap looking. Then I became a teacher here at Covalence, and then I began teaching Bootstrap. And then day in, day out on webinars, I'd be teaching folks Bootstrap and correcting issues I would see in lab reviews. So I'm kind of sick of it. Ironically, I'm picking a CSS kit that emulates Bootstrap class names because I feel like I'm so dependent on them. But it's not Bootstrap. It's actually going to be based on TailwindCSS, right? So I like how I had, this is probably bookmark doc screens here. So yeah, TailwindCSS, right? We have, come on now. Okay, this particular CSS kit is actually what we built our site and Gravity in. If you're a student here, then you've seen stylings from this CSS kit. And just like with all other things, it seems like a fantastic and awesome and cool tool until you build something in production with it and run into a bunch of edge cases when it comes to screen sizes and video aspect resolutions and stuff like that. It can be a bit of a nightmare to deal with. Like, there are pros and cons to Tailwind, and again, you've probably come across this. You've seen it rapidly grow in popularity. It's open source. It's free to use, and it's easy to use if you don't care about production sizes. Note on that later. I like Tailwind CSS still. Like, I have my gripes with it after building several projects with it, but I still feel like it provides a really modern, sleek feel to pretty much anything I ever build, right? How would I do this? But yeah, like, it is a cool CSS kit that I enjoy trying to force myself to learn and use and style with. I think some of my better portfolio sites are built with this, again, despite my gripes with it. My gripes, right? Well, that's more of just like a general pro and con list that I'd have for Tailwind CSS. But first and foremost, I think it defines itself as like a utility-first CSS system. Basically, if you know how to write CSS, then you don't have to write any CSS at all, asterisk. You instead just write class names that represent that CSS. You will never have to write a display flex class name because there's already a class name called flex that does that for you. These utility class names like PT4, MT5, like these values of like adding padding and margin quickly and consistently across my application are utility names that I loved in Bootstrap and I wish there were more of. And then surprise, surprise, I find an entire CSS kit that is freaking utilities and class names like that, right? So it's great to build fancy, nice-looking things fairly quickly and easily. Again, there's trade-offs for everything. There are some cons to this. I think I've already said that. It's easy to build things that feel consistent when it comes to layout, color, spacing, typography, shadows, all that kind of fun stuff. It's great to be able to build completely custom components. Like, even though I wish there was like card left or button primary to generate something like this, you would still be able to write like a whole bunch of class names that end up generating that button and what it looks like, right? So I would say this is like padding bottom and top 2, padding in the X direction by 4, text white, BG blue, something like that, text centered, like all those things inside of here build that button. But again, you wind up then with really extraordinarily long class names, which can be very difficult to deal with if you were just in a vanilla JS and HTML project. You would have some pretty ludicrous looking class names to generate what simply amounts to a button. There are some tips and tricks to deal with that, especially in a React ecosystem. We could always just extract it into its own component and style this as our custom button component that just adds those ludicrously long class names for us and maybe some props to customize them. And boom, would you have it? We can have an import button and have it be looking clean and nice everywhere. I do like that. So yeah, we're going to be choosing TailwindCSS here. And what it does is it scans all of your HTML files and your JavaScript files and your components and other templates for classes and whatnot. And it takes all these class names that you've used across your project, and then what it does is it generates the corresponding styles and generates the appropriate style tag in your head HTML. So what it'll end up doing is it ends up adding a big fat style tag up here with all the class names you need to build out your project. So again, that could mean you have fairly large HTML file sizes. We'll address that later when we get to production. But that's what it does. So it takes all that stuff, and that's what it does. So, like I was saying, pros and cons. I mean, it's easy and free to use. Like, if you don't care about production values and things like that, if you just want to mess around with this in development, if you want to add this to your little portfolio sites and you don't care about having a huge file attached to it, you can literally just grab their CDN via a script and you're pretty much ready to go. You can even provide a script tag to customize the configuration of the CDN, which I think is brilliant. Being able to just attach the CDN via a singular script tag and then adding your own configuration to it to begin playing with the customizability of it, I think is pretty dang cool, right? You can even add custom CSS with some of these things. It's their CDN is pretty dang awesome, and I've used it on plenty of my demonstrations to students about I introduce them to something other than Bootstrap, what Tailwind is, what it looks like, what it generates, and if they're like, hey, I'm having a tough time adding it to my project because there's so many things in the build process that, well, I'm like, well, just add it. For just like portfolio stuff and like development fun, just add this thing to your HTML page, call it a day, move on with your life. But we'll actually talk about how we're going to be using it and adding it here. They have a bunch of nifty guides if you want to add it to frameworks and whatnot. We don't really have a framework we're adding it to. So what is solid.js? I need to look into that. But they have Create React App, Next, and Gatsby, which are also the most popular ones to do, and Remix. Remix has been growing on my list of stuff I've been using recently. It's like Next.js, but even simpler, if you can believe it. So they have guides on how to add it to all these things. We're going to be using postcss to do so, and basically I'll take you through what this is all telling us to do here. So like I was saying, it's free and easy to use. That's always nice and important, right? Like we like that. We stand for kings and queens that make things free and easy to use. Open source for life. It allows us to do a lot of better CSS styling processes. Like it allows us to plug in and customize a lot of styling and options and configurations. It is insanely customizable. Like I was even saying that they have CDN. Their CDN link even allows you to customize what you get from them, which I think is amazing and very cool. It is very responsive. Like I've built my most mobile responsive sites using this particular framework and not even having to worry about writing media queries, which is my most hated thing to do. I'm sure someone out there that has any kind of UI UX experience will tell me how easy it is when you know like the values, but it's one of those things where I haven't had to write a lot of media queries thanks to things like Bootstrap and their call sizes and their breakpoints. And again, breakpoints here where you do MD:, LG:, XL:, etc., right? So the responsiveness is pretty freaking awesome. I very much appreciate it. And something that is really cool about it as well is, like I said, it has a gorillion class names in TailwindCSS, and you maybe even use a third of them on a sizable project. You can actually optimize it with a plugin called PurgeCSS that before it goes to production, it will go through all of your HTML, JS, JSX, TSX files, collect all the class names you used, and then purges the rest from the production output to make sure that the minimum style tag is generated inside of your index.html file to make sure it is optimized for production. I like that a lot, right? So I will say some issues though is again, that large HTML file size. Having a style tag that has a gorillion class names inside of it makes it hard to sometimes see what's going on. And you have that issue of, what's it called? Separation of concerns, where now all of your CSS is also in your HTML, whether it being sequestered to a CSS file where you can go and easily debug what the problem might be, if it's a styling issue or a class name or an ID selector and whatnot. So having everything crammed into your HTML file, you know, that kind of separation of concern, like where I've been separating components and things like that here very mindfully, don't have that. We're going to have that as a problem if we're using Tailwind CSS. There is a significant, small to large, depending on your experience, learning curve to use it. If you're already fairly comfortable with CSS syntax and general usage of properties such as, you know, using Flex or CSS Grid and things like that, if you already have like a pretty good understanding of those things, how selectors work and whatnot, then you'll be fine. It's pretty easy to pick up because, again, it is all the common properties you would always be writing anyway, just in the form of class names that are already written for you. But if you don't have a good grasp on CSS, then you have a pretty monumental learning curve, not only learning the CSS properties or syntax and what they do, but then you have to go and find the corresponding class name in Tailwind CSS and what opinions it might have about it or how it implements it. So it could be it has a very range learning curve depending on your personal experience here. Anything that requires an installation and configuration process just adds more chaos into the mix. It adds difficulty between what you're writing and what you're seeing in the browser. So things will update, deprecating API deprecating certain APIs on old modules will change and screw you over. It'll break the whole process here, and that can be an issue for a lot of students. I had like fresh alumni that go, hey, you talked about Tailwind, I wanted to give it a shot, and I realized I don't know how to freaking even add it here. I tried following their guide and it's not working. I don't know why. I'm like, oh, because you're on this version, got to update that to this, change this to that, move this over there, and then it should be working. And like, no, it's still not working. And I go look at their code and I realize there's another deprecated value I didn't take into consideration. So anything with the installation and build process can gum up the mix if you're not careful, right? And it's not an all-rounder. Like there's plenty of edge cases when it comes to the CSS class names it gives you that you may need to still write something for. Maybe you have to write a custom CSS file that applies certain CSS properties that aren't available or values that aren't available in the pre-built class names. Like if you have some complex use case for transitions or animations or whatnot, obviously there's only so much it's going to provide in terms of transitions and animations that it allows you to do before you have to go and start writing like your own class names, right? So it is not an all-rounder that solves every single use case. Like if you need something like this, that's fine, but if you need a bigger loader or something like that, you may have to write your own anyway. So you might resort to inline style tags, which will make things hard to style in the long run when you're wondering why something's being overridden, because again, the inline style attribute on HTML elements is the most specific way to style something, and it will override IDs and class and element selectors. So be careful with that. And then finally, mixing your HTML and your styling just kind of goes back to what I was saying about the file between HTML and no longer having a CSS file. That separation of concern when you begin mixing the two makes it difficult to sometimes debug state issues versus rendering issues versus styling issues and things like that. So again, there's lots of pros and cons. And that's kind of been, the entire journey of what we've talked about here in coding, right? Like every single decision I've made, I'm not going to use a fetching library. I'm going to write my own service file. It comes with a lot of downfalls, but it does teach you a lot of cool stuff along the way by trying to write it yourself. So yeah, we're going to be using Tailwind CSS, but we're not quite done yet. We're going to be using something that's built on top of, bear with me, on top of Tailwind called DaisyUI. This has actually been one of my most favorite. Why was I so zoomed out? That was weird. Sorry if that was kind of small text, y'all. Something that's been my goodness, I can't speak, that I found recently that I've enjoyed a lot when it comes to styling, because it kind of blends what I already knew from Bootstrap with Tailwind CSS. So I get all of the Tailwind CSS class names and all those beautiful margin padding and positioning utilities with the awesome and classic names I've come to know and love from Bootstrap, like button primary, button secondary, button accent, info, etc. So it gives me all these classic Bootstrap class names that I'm already familiar with, and it just gives them to me pre-combined. So again, this alert right here might just be class names of padding X2, padding Y4, text soft blue or like text blue 100 to make it like a light blue color, almost white. BG blue 500, make it like a deep blue color, right? And that itself could be a simple component rewrite with a bunch more class names added to it, but it just abstracts all those class names we'd have to go and look up in Tailwind and just gives us alert info, right? Alert info. And all of a sudden, boom, this beautifully styled element or border around it. Don't forget that. Maybe some light shadow underneath that border as well, underneath that element. So those are all like, it could be like 15 class names to make our own alert component. But again, DaisyUI simplifies it into this classic alert info style. Very, very bootstrapish, right? So it gives us a bunch of pre-written components that combine all those otherwise long and complicated Tailwind CSS class names to generate a nice little and simplified version that allows us to more quickly build out components and build out a nice looking website that's also mobile responsive. So we're going to be using DaisyUI, which combines Tailwind CSS underneath the hood to give us a nice and thematic way of building a cool website here. So yeah, their themes are also really nice, easy to customize colors and configurations or even customize components. I built a couple projects with this already, including labs in my standalone React course. Like, comment, subscribe. Check the description below, by the way, if you're interested in taking my standalone advanced React course. That will actually show you some cool things you could do with DaisyUI. And a lot of my labs and the demonstrations I built for my labs were built with DaisyUI because I've come to like it that much. So yeah, that's what we're going to start with here. And we got a couple more things to discuss other than just Tailwind and DaisyUI. So again, this has a build process. Let's go back to getting started, installation, using postcss. We are going to be using postcss to install and run all of our Tailwind stuff, because Tailwind by itself, we need to tell it how to import all those CSS class names that Tailwind provides, how to add them to our React application, how to load those things. Oh boy, that sounds like some webpack territory. Remember that? Our good old friend loader from like the first video right here. TS-loader, how to appropriately handle loading those kinds of files. We'll have to write the same thing for how to handle CSS files and how to handle even more more abstract stuff like things that aren't native to CSS. How do we deal with that? So we're going to be using postcss to do that, right? And postcss is a JavaScript tool that basically transforms your CSS with JavaScript, meaning we get to use a whole bunch. It takes all of your CSS and uses JavaScript to generate what's called an abstract syntax tree, and then provides an API for analyzing and modifying using JavaScript plugins. So basically, it is an awesome node tool to be able to use the latest and greatest CSS stuff and have it generate out safe browser CSS, right? And it allows us to do a lot of cool things. Like postcss is a pretty dang cool tool for Node, right? It also has a huge ecosystem of plugins that allow us to really customize how our CSS is transformed or transpiled by postcss. So it's not a compiler or a bundler. It's not a post processor or, despite its name, post processor or preprocessor. It's just a transpiler that turns special postcss plugin syntax into browser-friendly and safe vanilla CSS. That's what's so cool about it, because obviously in order to import and use all the Tailwind stuff, we're going to have to use some fancy plugin for postcss syntax, and that needs to be taken and generating the appropriate vanilla CSS that's going to be loading safely in our browser. Postcss is the tool we're going to be doing that with. Now, something else that's really cool, we're going to be using a plugin right here, reference right here, called autoprefixer that we're going to be using right away with postcss because it's that important. Autoprefixer is a postcss plugin that will parse all of your CSS and add vendor prefixes using the CanIUse database to determine which prefixes are needed. So CanIUse is a very nifty site to know, especially when it comes to like style or CSS properties, what is available in which browser and what version or syntax is different amongst other browsers. So I think that's pretty dang cool, where this website has a database that autoprefixer will use to generate the appropriate CSS. So what do we mean by that, right? So as an example, we may write the following. a class selector called example, display grid, transition, all 0.5 seconds. Now, that might be fine for us in Chrome when developing, but in production, our friend using something else like their Safari browser might have a different, or like Edge or something else, or Lord forbid, IE. Like they may have different syntax class names that are required for that CSS property that you tested to work. So autoprefixer will take this code or this CSS that you write, and it will transpile it to add those additional other browser syntaxes to make sure it can safely run as universal as possible, because nobody will actually know, unless they do this for a living, all the appropriate CSS syntax and property names across all browsers. So autoprefixer helps us deal with that, which I think is simply incroyable. So yeah, postcss, right? Autoprefixer, Tailwind, DaisyUI, and then finally we're down to webpack. We're going to have a couple loaders in order for this to actually work. We're going to need something called postcss-loader. Surprise, surprise, postcss-loader is just a webpack rule that we're going to add here that tells it, hey, we need to be able to use postcss from within webpack, because otherwise we would have to write it somewhere in our scripts here, which could get kind of messy. We're instead going to use postcss-loader to say, hey, I want to use postcss in the process of webpack doing its thing. So we're going to say there's going to be a plugin to do that. Then we need a CSS loader, right? Because now we're going to be writing some kind of CSS line here in our code, and it has to know how to interpret that CSS level import. It's going to be a module that, again, tells Webpack during the bundling process what to do. It allows us, it tells Webpack to collect all CSS from all the CSS files referenced in our project and puts them into a string, because that string is going to be outputted into our HTML in that style tag, right? It also allows us to configure how many loaders before CSS-loader are allowed to run. I'll get into that in just a minute. And then finally, we need to have style loader. It takes that string generated by CSS-loader and it outputs that string inside the HTML file. That's all it does. So it takes all that outputted CSS-loader string and correctly slaps it into our style tag in our head tag of our HTML. And then finally, we're going to have a plugin for our client-side configuration here, not server. Remember, this is all client right now, called HTML Webpack Plugin. It's going to simplify the creation process of HTML files to serve with Webpack, and in development as well, I think it generates HTML pages with a custom hash in the browser to know when our style element has changed. So it's like, oh, if this hash in the browser is the same as our current hash, that means no styling changes have happened, so load it faster for development, right? So it helps during the compiling and bundling process to make sure that we're quickly generating or not needing to generate fresh HTML files based on, or changing the style tag in that HTML file. So it's kind of like a nice development tool when messing with all these things here. So I have done a lot of rambling, I've realized, in this video. It's already been 27 minutes. I've written no code, but hopefully y'all have understood some of what I've been saying and kind of following along. But now let's actually write all this crap out to see what it ends up looking like here. So like I said, we're going to have to install a couple tools in order to actually have this to work. We're going to need, obviously, DaisyUI, because that is the eventual UI I want, the CSS class names I want to be using. It is built on TailwindCSS, obviously, and we're going to have all those lovely utility class names still available to us from TailwindCSS. I had mentioned we're going to need HTML Webpack plugin. That was for generating appropriate HTML files with hash file names for development purposes during the recompiling process that's going to be happening here. I did say we need style loader. We need CSS loader. These are Webpack plugins now. postcss-loader was the other one. postcss-loader. Obviously, we're going to need postcss and autoprefixer. So like I said, here's one of the cons of trying to include Tailwind in something else. I'm all of a sudden installing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 new modules and adding them to the build process. It's going to add to complexity and probably screw up somewhere along the way. Let's be real. I probably typoed one of these and just haven't noticed. But I think that's at a minimum what we need to get Tailwind and Daisy going here. Ugh, my goodness. Let's see what happens. Dead air. Dead air. Hey, all right. Well, that's a nice change of pace. Looks like everything installed properly, so let's go start adding our stuff in here. First things first, we gotta tell our Webpack, hey, some new stuff is gonna be happening here. So I'm going to bring in a new variable called HTML. Actually, I think it's lowercase. Yeah, it's a class that we're going to be instantiating here. So we're going to be following the conventions for a ES6 JavaScript class, where they will use capital case letters for class names, and it'll be HTML Webpack plugin. Okay, so to use a plugin, we're going to provide a new property in our client config. Now, it's not inside the module resolve or output properties of Webpack. It's going to be a sibling property to them. So keep that in mind. We're going to say plugins because it's going to be an array, because you can have multiple plugins. And unlike rules and loaders, the order of plugins is not important. So you can have plugins in any order you want, no problem whatsoever. So we're going to say in our plugins array, because we might have multiple in the future, I don't know, we're going to instantiate a new HTML Webpack plugin class. And if we don't provide an argument, it will default to a templated index HTML, but we have a template that we want it to follow. So we're going to say, hey, the template is inside of our root directory, public index.html. It should be the location of our template. That's where we're going to be templating our index.html file. We're going to tell it, use that and don't write your own. Otherwise, it will write its own. I think it does like I don't remember if it did like a dist folder or not. It probably won't because I told it where this resolves. But yeah, we're going to tell it that's our template right there. Yeah, the required path to the template. Our template is this index HTML we wrote a long time ago. I think video 1. Okay, with that plugin in place. Next, we need to tell it, just like with this, we told our Webpack compiler, bundler, during this process, we need to use TS-loader to compile our thing. So during the Webpack process, we gave it a rule to follow on TSX files. Now, we're going to add a new rule. So we're going to do a sibling object to the TSX test. Again, it's going to test for a certain file name. We're going to use some very basic regular expressions here to say find all CSS file names. We're only going to have one, thankfully, but we still got to tell it how to find it, and it's going to test it by finding it as a CSS file. Then we are going to tell it to use. Okay, now unlike up here, we had one loader and some options for it and whatnot. This is going to have several loaders that are going to run in a specific order. And Webpack will run a reverse execution order. So index 0 will actually be the last thing that runs, and index length -1 will be the first thing that runs in this array. So the first thing that has to run needs to be the end of our array. So we're going to be working in reverse order here. So the first thing that has to run is, well, postcss-loader. That has to go ahead and run and be the first thing that runs, because we're going to have some, well, we need this JavaScript code we're writing and to be correctly transpiled with whatever configurations we apply using the postcss tool. And we're saying, hey, we have postcss installed on this project, and I want you to use it during the Webpack process. Because remember, postcss-loader is just a Webpack plugin that says, hey, we're going to be using postcss in the bundling process and not have to write an individual step forward ourselves in our scripts. Okay? Now, if that's the first thing that runs, the next thing I needed to do is to generate that giant CSS string, right? So that's why here, we're going to write CSS-loader. But that string value is not enough, because we do have some things that have to happen before CSS-loader generates its string. And it needs to make sure that post-CSS-loader works. Now, I'm going off of documentation here, and I actually haven't tried this, but we might actually experiment to see if it still works or not. But we're going to actually nix this and replace it with an object that has a property called loader. We're going to say CSS-loader. And I need a list of options, okay? I think it's called import loaders. Let me look at my notes real quick, y'all. Import loaders, remind me. Yeah, so CSS-loader is a module that would help Webpack to collect CSS from all the CSS files referenced in our app and puts it into a string. The option import loaders allows you to configure how many loaders before CSS-loader should be applied to imported resources and CSS module ICSS imports. So with post-CSS, we can do crazy import statements of entire CSS files into a component or multiple components or our entire app, or import entire other CSS files by writing import statements, almost like Sass. But we need to tell it that we want to make sure that 1, 2, or more loaders are going to have to run before CSS-loader. It defaults to 0, which means nothing loads before it, but I'm going to provide an import loaders value of 1 to make sure that post-CSS-loader is going to run before CSS-loader does its job. And then finally, the last thing that needs to run in this whole process, like I said, is what takes all that generated string and loads it into a style tag into our index.html file. So that's what our loaders, our tests, are going to look like here in our Webpack configuration. Okay? I know this seems a little bit confusing. Just go look, double check the documentation. You'll see I just copied and pasted the definition of it. And it says do this if something has to run, such as post CSS-loader, before CSS-loader does its job. And it needs to, and we'll see here why in just a moment. Okay. Now that I have this configured, I need to now tell Tailwind how it needs to generate its content and if any plugins we have for it. We have a plugin for Tailwind CSS. It's called DaisyUI, the one I want to use. So Tailwind needs to know how it needs to be configured. So I'm going to say, in the root of our project, we're going to make a file called tailwindconfig.js. We're going to do a module.exports, and we're going to tell it two things. The content that we need to look for in where we are looking for class names for eventually autoprefixing and eventually purge CSSing and things like that. It's going to be in our source client folder. We're not going to be using class names in the server folder. And I'm going to say any recursive path in the client folder, we're probably going to be finding a CSS file, class names, all that kind of fun stuff. And we're going to say that it's going to have a multiple set of prefixes that might include JS, TS, JSX, TSX. So any of those file extensions in our client folder in any kind of subfolder directory, doesn't matter. Those are where we're going to be finding our class names to do our stuff with. And then also we have a potential array of plugins that we could include. I have a couple that I typically use with Tailwind, but for right now we're simply going to require the singular DaisyUI. Cool. That's our singular plugin we currently have that we're going to be using with Tailwind. So there we go. That should configure our Tailwind process here. And now we still have to configure post CSS because we haven't included autoprefixer anywhere yet. So in order to dictate and tell Webpack, hey, when you're using post CSS-loader during your bundling process, here's what it should do. By adding, yes, you guessed it, another root level config file. This root directories of some of these projects are pretty gnarly, I gotta say. Okay, so in our post CSS, we're gonna do exporting out an object that will say, hey, here are the following plugins I want working for post CSS. Require Tailwind, because we have to take and generate all of its crazy code into our whole process here. And also output it using the autoprefixer plugin to make sure it generates awesome cross-browser compatible safe CSS. So that's the simplest our process needs to be for our post CSS configuration. Now, in the Tailwind documentation, you'll see here that we've done all the installation part. We have added Tailwind and post CSS configurations. We've written our template paths. We now need to add Tailwind directives to our CSS. So this is how we're going to add our CSS to this project and tell it to import and use all of those juicy class names that Tailwind provides for us. I'm going to make a styles folder for now. And inside the styles folder, we're going to have a simple app.css because it's going to represent the entire application's CSS from here. Now, we're going to write at Tailwind, all the base class names, at Tailwind, all the components class names that we can use, and at Tailwind, bring in all those juicy utilities. Hopefully I didn't make a typo here. So if you're wondering, Luke, this don't look like CSS, homeboy. You're right, it ain't. This is post CSS code with Tailwind. We get to write. Post CSS will know how to correctly transpile it to browser vanilla safe CSS. Right? Ooh, I got a typo. Boom. There we go. That's what I'm talking about, y'all. So we have our CSS ready to go. It'll be transpiled by postcss correctly. With any luck, I've been writing all the stuff correctly. I can't believe this one video was just explaining my style choices and trying to get all this installed and running, and it's already been 40 minutes and I haven't actually styled anything yet. I knew this was going to be a rough one, and the next one will be actually making our current site look a little bit prettier, and hopefully y'all have learned something about Webpack and configurations and trade-offs about the choices we make in this process. Now, all I need to do is go to my index, because this is going to represent the global CSS for a whole application, or you can put it in app.tsx. It needs to be at some top level. Now, you're like, but you're not importing any code. I know. This is where postcss-loader, style-loader, CSS-loader, and then style-loader come into play. We get to write this cool-looking syntax, and we have a rule that knows how to handle it, and a loader during the Webpack bundling process that knows how to handle it. So this is not writable in any of your TSX code unless at a bare minimum you have CSS-loader and style-loader somewhere as a test and use. That is the only reason I can get away with writing that kind of an import statement, all right? That is not, I have to always tell this to my students, this ain't some magic React thing. You get to use it in like Next.js and create React app and all those fun things because they've already configured that use case for you. If we're writing our own custom project from scratch or using that Covalence boilerplate for the final couple of labs, y'all have probably learned this crap don't work. So you have to then go and add to the configuration of Webpack, hey, CSS-loader, style-loader, that way I can import CSS files into application scope. Now, because I chose to import it where I render my app, my entire app, aka the whole dang thing, should now have access to all the juicy styling and customization from Tailwind and DaisyUI, folks. Let's go! We're going to head to our home view. To our home view, we're going to pray this is going to work here. We're going to add a div, and a button element with the class names of button primary. Get used to me writing a lot of Emmet shortcuts here. If you're in VS Code, if you're a student of mine, you probably already know these. If you're kind of fresh here, Emmet shortcuts or Emmet abbreviations are ways of quickly scaffolding HTML, JSX, TSX, whatever, with IDs and class names and attributes. So .button means add a class name of button, and a .button dash primary means add another class name of button primary. There you go. Test button will be the text of this button, and with whatever the default theme of DaisyUI is, I don't know what their default theme is. I'm going to close out some of these now. Whatever the default theme of DaisyUI is, we're going to very quickly see, and we're going to see if we can change it by the end of this video. So let's go to the home page. I haven't refreshed anything yet, so I'm going to close my eyes and refresh this. My heart sank, and then I remembered how dumb I am. All right, let's let it rebuild here. Hey, all right, hold on. I saw some output there. Yo, let's go. All right, let's go, y'all. It recognized I have DaisyUI installed and ready to go. Do I see? Yeah, check it out. I see style loader, CSS loader being fired there, so that tells me that it's actually bundling stuff correctly. Yeah, let's go! We have our massive amount of class names and crap being added here from all this juicy stuff we got going on. Actually, it's not that bad. I think is it actually auto purging? Is that something that's automatically built in now? I thought I had to include it because that does not seem like as many class names as I thought I would need, unless it's just no. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. Oh, speaking of looking into things, from a previous video, I have no clue what went wrong with the React Dev Tools because I stopped the project, I think restarted my computer, went to the gym, came back, and I was like, oh yeah, I need to see why my React Dev Tools aren't working to make sure it's something that I didn't do. They just started working again on this project, and I didn't change anything from that last video, so I don't know what to tell y'all. It started working again. But like I said, there is CSS loader stringing everything, and then style loader cramming it as a style tag into the head of our HTML. That is what I'm talking about. I'm trying to hope I can find the class name somewhere here, but There's all like the opinionated stuff that like, so Tailwind CSS is a strong reset of everything. As you can see, even my links no longer have like visited and underlines and things like that. It is a strong opinionated reset that it does. So careful with that information and what it could do for you here. So you can even see the comments of where it says, hey, this is the changes we're going to make to these elements by default here. So there's some auto prefixing, as you can see, going on here. Huh. Very cool. Very cool. There's the data theme. We'll talk about that in a minute here. Yeah, well, all right then. Yeah, we're looking solid. We got some cool looking class names that generate a good looking website. It looks like it's like a dark theme by default. So what if you wanted to use a different theme? Thankfully, it's very easy to, well, as you can see, we simply go to this is probably the Tailwind config, yeah. And we can provide an array of themes we want to use, or if we want to remove them, we simply provide the themes that we wish to be used here. So it has some defaults. Looks like I think it's using my system default, which is dark mode. But let's go change it to, I don't know. What do we want to use for this whole thing here? Lo-fi. Cyberpunk is going to make my eyes bleed. I like synthwave. That looks pretty cool. Cupcake, retro. What? Fantasy. I mean, why not? I mean, we're building a DnD note taker. There's no reason not to use fantasy here. So let's see if we can generate the appropriate theme for our application now. Like I said, I'm going to head to my Tailwind configuration. I'm going to now write a DaisyUI object for configuring this properties, a themes property that has a array of possible themes, and I only want the fantasy theme available and remove all other unnecessary themes and their code from our plugin DaisyUI here. With that singular change alone, it looks like it recognized that I changed the configuration there. And we're in fantasy mode. Look at that. Ha ha! Let's go. Oh, this looks terrible now. Yeah, there's going to have to be some serious reconfiguring. But yeah, as you can see, I have a brilliant looking little test button there ready to go with like no work on my end. So 46 minutes of just configuring something to make a button look pretty. Welcome to development, folks. Welcome to modern web development, and especially in React and a NPM module world. This is how it works. A lot of the times you'll be getting a job where this is already built in for you and you just get to use all of it nicely. But hey, there's no way in hell, wherever, that y'all didn't learn something about Webpack, Tailwind, postcss, plugins, tests. Remember, these are reverse order important. Plugins are not. They don't matter, even though I only have one right now. But hopefully you'll learn something along the way about how all this stuff works behind the scenes, like how the sausage is made kind of deal here. Because y'all, again, when you come to using like Tailwind or Daisy with like Create React app or something, typically it's very simple to just add it and get going with it because all those things behind the scenes are already coded for you. But again, I feel like you get a greater appreciation of those things, Remix, Next, Create React App, Svelte, Angular, and how simple it ends up being adding some of those CSS rules in there because it's all already written for you. Whereas having to write it yourself can be such a nightmare to deal with, and now you can see why. But hey, we learned something along the way, and that's it for this video. I'll see you on the next one where we actually begin adding some style here. I'm going to probably build I'm going to build a drawer. I think I like drawers because they scale to mobile UIs better. We're going to build a drawer to move all these things into with a nav bar and a side drawer and making sure we render everything and have it like be an opaque layer we can click on and have the drawer open and close. After we build that drawer out, we're going to go and just style each of our things here fairly quickly. Oh God, this is going to be so much work to do. But I will, before the next video, write it all myself the first go around and take notes so that way you don't see me bumbling with design decisions. I'm not saying I'm an expert in UI or UX or even any good at it. I have some bad habits. I got some good habits. We're going to make sure it's fairly mobile responsive because if this is a portfolio project, realistically our friends, family, recruiters, and interviewers will be looking at it on their mobile device first and foremost, not a desktop widescreen, ultra widescreen view. So we're going to make sure it scales half decently. We're going to make sure that it looks okay-ish. I'm not going to be really spouting off a lot of UI UX stuff other than some basics that I just personally know. So yeah, it won't be intensive, and that's something I'm going to probably pre-write and take notes on so I can take you through the process without you seeing me go, for PX4 or PX6. Both of those seem kind of big. Maybe down to PX. I don't want to spend like an hour debating my padding in the X direction. I'd rather just add it on there, and if you want to goof with it more yourself, you're welcome to. Or if you don't even care about like how I'm going to style something, you could just begin styling it yourself and just, be prepared that our class names are clearly not going to sync up if you're going to style it yourself, or if you're going to choose a different CSS kit for yourself like Bulma or Bootstrap because you just feel more comfortable with it. It doesn't matter to me. But when it comes to functionality, you'll learn some cool stuff along the way regardless. So yeah, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, check the description below for getting involved with the Covalence community, and I'll see y'all in the next part of this playlist series. It's going to continue on until I probably die.